Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we're going to be continuing our series of the Academic Job Search series for engineering students specifically. My name is Gian Molina. I'm currently the Assistant Director of Futures, your one-stop shop for all career and professional development, both for doctoral students and postdoctoral fellows. And today, it's my honor to be inviting and hosting three amazing professors from Johns Hopkins. We have today Dr. Vicky Nguyen, who is the Marlin Zimmerman Jr. Faculty Scholar and Professor of Mechanical Engineering with second appointments in Material Sciences and Ophthalmology. And her research focuses on the biomechanics of fibrous soft tissues, constitutive modeling of shape memory polymers, and polymer composite, the fracture and failure of rate-dependent materials. Secondly, we have Dr. Matthias Umberath, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science here at Johns Hopkins University, where he builds collaborative intelligent systems for computer-assisted medicine. More relevant for this audience is that he just has been selected to receive the JHU Career Impact Award, among other contributions for his Future Faculty course that prepares senior trainees, such as yourself, in computer specifically and adjacent disciplines for the academic job search. And finally, but not least important, Dr. Jude Phillip, who is an assistant professor of biomedical engineering with joint appointments in the departments of chemical and biomolecular engineering, oncology, and is a core member in the Institute for Nanobiology. And his lab studies aging with an emphasis on using properties of cells to explain why individuals age and experience diseases differently. And prior to joining Hopkins, Jude was a postdoctoral fellow of hematology at Weill Cornell Medical College, and he's an alum. He completed his doctoral studies here at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much, everyone, for accepting our invitation and joining us today. And for everyone, this conversation for the first half will be moderated through a series of questions, get the insights and experiences from our panelists. Around 12:30 p.m., we're going to be opening up the room for any questions you may have. At that time, feel free to unmute yourself to interact with our speakers. And throughout the entire duration of the panel, I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions and you are not able to turn your audio on, feel free to drop it in the chat and I will read it for you. And finally, we encourage everyone to turn on their videos if you are comfortable doing so to have a better interaction with our panelists here today. So to start with our conversation, I would love for our panelists, each of you, to share a brief overview of your academic job interview experience, including the type of institutions that you interview with and any memorable moments or even challenges that you face throughout this process. Dr. Umberath, I will start with you.
Sure. I have found that this is something that people don't like to talk about too openly, because especially once you are in a career that is considered permanent, you are no longer supposed to be interviewing other places necessarily. And so that sometimes makes it difficult to have candid conversations with your mentors on to structure interviews, because supposedly their last interview is years ago, which is not always true. And so I will just say that. The other thing is that for me, I've been interviewing at multiple different places, not primarily in the US, but during my postdoc phase in Germany. My work makes it such that I interview either in electrical engineering, computer science, biomedical engineering departments, or at the School of Medicine. Those interviews are a little different, so I can share some experiences in this. And I think I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phillip.
Yeah, so I interviewed right before COVID. So I started in September 2020, right? So I guess that my last few interviews were right during COVID, so then it switched to virtual. But I interviewed, my degrees are in chemical engineering, but my research is very much more biomedical engineering or more bio-related. So when I applied to both biomedical engineering programs and chemical engineering programs with a preference with more of the programs in biomedical engineering. And if I were to throw out like some numbers in terms of, I applied to, I think, about 16 programs with more BME than chemical engineering. I heard back from 12, had, I think, about seven or nine interviews. And then based on that, when the offers came in, narrowed it down to 2. So went 5 offers, 2, and then narrowed down from Hopkins and one other place.
Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Nguyen?
Hi. So I'm, I guess, the senior person here, which means that I interviewed way a long time ago. I did actually do 2 phases of interviews. The first time was when I graduated with my PhD in 2004. And I think I went through I think I applied to 12 schools, got interviews at a bunch of them, was actually offered a job, turned it down, went to the national labs and was there for 3 years. And then I decided that I switched my research completely and then realized that if I wanted to continue in this line of research, I do need to be in academia. So I interviewed again, but with a much more narrowed down list because I had a husband at that time and we had a 2-body problem and I couldn't be in the middle of nowhere. So I applied to like 4 schools in California, Hopkins, and one other school outside of California that I knew well. And I only got the interview at Hopkins and they offered me the job and here I am. So since then, I have been approached by a few schools as a person of interest and that interview process is not really an interview process and it's really, really different. It's kind of for you to see whether or not you fit there or they fit or they see whether or not you fit. And again, it's more of a get to know you kind of thing. So I don't think you want to hear about that aspect. Also, the last time I interviewed, really truly interviewed was 2000. So a lot has changed since then. So I can give you some perspective as a person who's on the other side. But I think a lot of things that I'll say or my experience is just really old.
Thank you so much for sharing. For the next part that we want to dive a little bit into more details of this process, I will start with you, Dr. Philip, and then we'll wrap it up with Dr. Nguyen with that perspective on the other side from someone assessing these interviews. So I would like to dive a little bit deeper. And Dr. Philip, can you describe specifically a job talk presentation that you gave during your interview process? What was the topic? How did you approach preparing and delivering it effectively that ultimately led to you getting the job? How was that process and how did you prepare to have that amazing delivery and preparation?
I guess in the beginning, in terms of putting it together, it's pretty nerve-wracking, like just thinking through the process. I can look back now and see that I was in the early stages. It was very, you feel very nervous because you're essentially putting yourself out there, not only in things that you've done, but things that you plan to do. And definitely through the interview process, my job talk, my pitch kind of, it was tweaked and optimized to suit. But I had an interesting piece of it because I switched fields, right? So I did my PhD in chemical engineering, and there I did a lot of cell biophysics, mainly focused on cancer for the first half of it, and then switched completely to aging, right? So we were developing all these cell-based tools for aging, but ultimately I wanted my research to be able to encompass not only the aging piece, but also the technology piece and the medicine piece. So after my PhD, I left engineering per se, and then did my postdoc in hematology. So for my job talk, I had to figure out a creative way to craft in the engineering piece with the medicine piece, but still keeping it at some sort of flavor of engineering, right? Because I think one of the ultimate goals of the job talk, at least when I think of it, is yes, you want to showcase your science, but you want to also engage the audience, right? So in a sense, if I'm interviewing, like when I was interviewing at a chemical engineering department, which had less bio-focused people in some cases, I would I would tune it to slightly focus more on the technology, the vision, and how I'm going to really use that environment to kind of build my program. Versus that when I was going into something more heavily biomedical engineering, I can truly have more of, the seamless interaction between the engineering piece, the medicine piece, and then how that builds in. But overall, my first job talk was probably not the best one. It kind of like optimizes as you go. And I think those are things that that happen naturally through the process. In some of the places, I also got really good feedback on the job talk. Like some of the faculty, like I would meet with them and they would talk about like, oh yeah, your talk was like really great. And then some of the more senior ones sometimes would give me like a little bit of feedback. Like they would say, like you present so much stuff. It's so comprehensive. You need to give people stuff to ask, right? So sometimes you don't have to give all of what you did. You don't have to give the whole story. You give the key links and then let people kind of process it. So those are some of the feedback that I got like early on in the process that I was able to incorporate as I went on. And, those are, I think in the long term ended up working well. Because in the beginning, you're kind of like stretched for time because you have so much things you want to present in that like 45 minutes, then you run to 50. But then by that time, you kind of like get it. So I think getting that advice early that you don't have to showcase everything. You have to give the key links to highlight your research, highlight your vision, and then, take it from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Very insightful. Dr. Umarath, can you guide us through a specific job talk presentation that you gave, and how did you approach preparing and delivering it effectively?
Yeah, I would like not to do that. And the reason why I would like not to do that is because this is going to be very specific for everybody here in the audience. And what makes my presentation strong is not going to be what makes other presentations strong, right? And that's something that I'm always telling people, is to understand what your unique selling point is. And that's important not just for your talk and for how you interview, but it's important for all of your preparations for the interview phase. Like if you're comparing, if you're comparing apples and oranges, you're always going to conclude that some is stronger than the other. And so that's why, it's very difficult, because you will compare necessarily your strengths with other people's weaknesses and the other way around. And that's why making very specific examples, I think, is very difficult. So keeping it from a high level, I think what Jude says makes a lot of sense, in the sense that, I find it difficult to separate you as the applicant and the other people as the interviewees, or as the interviewers. And that's because you are catering to that audience. So if you're removing your own perspective from what the other people will expect, then you're probably not doing a great job, because your talk and everything that you write essentially should be designed for a specific audience. This is exactly what Jude was saying, right? Understand who you're talking to. Because if your talk goes over the head of everybody in that room, or like 90% of the people in that room, that will not bode well. Right. So if you're talking about machine learning and you talk to a CS audience, well, you can assume that most of these people will know what the basics of machine learning are. If you're talking to a biomedical engineering audience or a mechanical engineering audience, well, then maybe, your topic is actually pushing the boundaries of what they currently know. And so you need to start simple enough in order for them to understand why your research is important. Right. There's a bit of an interest in, or there's a bit of a risk in telling everything about everything you ever did. That's perhaps a bad idea. You do want to make sure that you have enough breadth in your talk to make sure that, well, actually, you're applying as a colleague. You're not going there as a student and trying to beg for their appreciation of your work. That's not what you're doing. You're going to go there to sell your program, your research program, and showcase how when hired, you will provide learning and growth opportunities for multiple PhD students. And so that's why you need to somehow demonstrate breadth, not only in the work that you have done, but especially the work that you will do in the future, right? But you also need to be demonstrating depth, because if you're not doing that, then, well, are you actually a technical expert, or have you been successful because you just piggyback on other people's success? So you need to select one topic that you find the most interesting, or that is just the strongest that you have, and go a little bit greater into detail on how exactly you solve the fundamental technical challenges that other people in this field might also encounter, to motivate why your research is not just, well, it's intellectually challenging and will provide, food for multiple years to come. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Nguyen, I will do a two-part question for you here. So if you could share a little bit, back in the days, how did you prepare for your interview? And a couple of tips here, for how to effectively deliver it, that you may have seen in candidates that you have interviewed as you have been in the academic spaces for longer periods of times.
Yeah. I think what Matthias said is really true. You do want to balance the fact that you're going to be presenting your work to a diverse audience, right? So your seminar is going to be a seminar, most likely. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it's a special seminar, but most likely it's a department seminar. And then you have to remember that you're presenting to grad students, as well as if you're in mechanical engineering department, think about how broad mechanical engineering is, presenting your deep work to all your colleagues, potential colleagues. So you do want to make sure that's accessible, but at the same time, you do need to show depth. You cannot just be a flashy, glitzy advertisement. That is very off-putting to the committee, to many committee members. Maybe some committees, they're not so off-putting, but it can be really off-putting if all you're doing is just showing fun movies, because they're not there to evaluate your ability to show fun movies. They're really there to evaluate your ability to explain in detail, but also in an accessible way to teach. Think about it that way, to teach your work, right? So I think it's really important to be able to lay out your talk, practice it a bunch of times to people who don't know, who are not specifically in your area of expertise, and make sure that they understand what you're trying to do, right? So the technical detail, maybe they don't understand the equations, but they'll understand your motivation as to why you're going into this detail. So that's the presentation skills, right? But you also do want to make sure that you have the depth in your presentation. In your chalk talk, it's really a misnomer. We don't really do chalk anymore. It's more of like, here's my 5-year plan about what I'm going to do and the projects that I will champion and write up as grant proposals. There, you really need to make sure you cover, I would say, what's in the executive summary of your proposal that you're thinking of. Here's the big picture. Here's the specific problem that I want to address, or the sets of problems. I'm perfectly set up to do this because I've had this background, and this is my proposed approach. I don't have all the pieces here yet, but this is a general outline of how I'm going to approach it. And then it's going to really help me to be here because I can pull people, or I can use this resource here or that resource there. So don't forget to like really set up your job talk. A lot of times in my experience, where candidates kind of fall apart is that job talk, the chalk talk, because they're just not really prepared for that level of kind of care and thoughtfulness it takes to plan out what a research program is. If you're just out of your PhD, that's going to be a really hard thing to do. I understand that. And so the committee will take that into account if they're looking at somebody who's just graduated from their PhD versus somebody who's been in a postdoc for a couple of years versus somebody who's is an assistant professor and is looking to move. So the committee will judge you based on your experience level. And if they picked you as somebody coming straight out of your PhD, they most likely are not going to expect like a super detailed career proposal ready job talk. But do your best, try and hit all those kind of outline headings of motivation, why your specific problem, why you're uniquely suited to do that, and as much of a plan as you can. So I would say focus on that. Don't forget to focus on that.
Thank you so much. I would like to continue that same line of thought, Dr. Nguyen. And after you give the presentation, you start in the Q&A process. And often, you may receive challenging or even unexpected questions. So how did you handle any challenging or unexpected question during your own job talk, or any general advice that you can give our students on how to handle those?
Well, first of all, you don't just only get unexpected and surprising questions and challenging questions at a job talk, you get it everywhere. So it's just a good skill to develop in general. I mean, I get it all the time when I go to give seminar talks. If you're doing something interesting, you're going to get challenging questions. If you're doing something controversial, you're going to get challenging questions. So yeah, it's a general skill to develop. I think just go to conferences, practice, give talks. You'll get challenging questions and you just have to figure out how to field them. If you don't really know the answer to whatever is being asked, just kind of deflect and say, that's a great question. I haven't thought about it, but I'd be love to talk to you afterwards to understand more about your perspective. That's perfectly fine. If it's a question about the detail in your work, you better know. There's just no way around it, right? It's really it's not good if you're presenting something and someone's asking you the details of your method and you're not able to answer. But most likely that's not going to happen. But if it is an extension about something that you haven't thought about, just be straightforward about it. I'd like to talk to you more about it. I haven't thought about it, but I'd like to learn more about the perspective.
Thank you so much. Dr. Umberath or Dr. Philip, do you have any thoughts or comments around these about challenging or unexpected questions during job talk or interviews?
I agree with exactly what Vicky said in the sense that, like you feel it, you get better at it with more practice. But then, a lot of times, like some of these challenging questions, maybe you may not know the answer, but maybe nobody knows the answer, right? So that's ways to kind of also highlight if particularly there's areas that you're going to investigate in the future and say like, yeah, we're going to be working on this, and you can share some thoughts around it, even without having maybe like a direct answer if it's not known, right? But I think just the approach is in the sense of getting, to some extent, you have to have some comfort in not knowing sometimes, right? I think the perspective from students, or even, like it happens to me sometimes, like you kind of like fumble, you be like, okay, I should know this. But then you have to have that level of comfort in a sense that, you can go, if it's knowable, right? There's some ways that you can approach it. Like your approach could get you from the known to the unknown kind of piece. But a lot of it is sort of like having that, knowing how to deal with those situations when you don't exactly know the answer. And as scientists, that's what we do, right? We pursue questions, the answer to. So
you know where I get the most challenging questions are really from students because they have fresh perspective, right? They're not challenging you to kind of make you uncomfortable. They're challenging you because they're coming from a totally different angle. And it's kind of fun. So I agree with you. Just you have to be okay with it and be open to it and be comfortable with it. And as long as you project that kind of openness and confidence, you should be okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. For the audience, after this next question, I will open up the floor more officially for any questions from all of you. So be ready on getting all your thoughts and questions ready for in a couple of minutes. This next question, Dr. Umbarath, I would like to start with you, then Dr. Philip, and finishing with Dr. Nguyen. How should candidates go about researching the institution and the department that they are interviewing with? And what role really does this research play in the interview process?
It makes a huge difference, right? I mean, how are you going to do it? Well, there's Google, there's Bing, I'm sure you know how to find information. The more important part is to actually do it, right? Sit down and take the time to take a look at who is going to talk to you. You will get a game plan the day, sometimes just the night before your actual interview that will tell you who you're going to be meeting with, where your meetings are, blah, 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 right? So you should know every single one of these people, right? And so you should go and prepare by taking a look. I mean, how much can you learn, right? If you really only have a day or if you have 2 days, how much are you going to learn about these individual people? You're probably not going to get it right immediately, but there are a few things that you definitely should be doing. You should understand what is their overall research program about? Is there immediate intersection with what it is that you are doing? Are they part of specific centers, institutes, other core facilities that exist at that university that are particularly relevant to your own mission and your own program? Because that will be transformational, right? If you have access to those things, then you can immediately talk about how that would be transformational for you, which essentially just reverberates your interest in actually coming to that school because you know something about it, right? And you can take a look at their more recent publications. You know how publication works, so definitely don't look at the publications where they are an author somewhere in the middle, like many of the students do that email us. Look at the stuff that they are either the lead author or the senior author on, that they have done work on recently, and try to discover themes, right? Individual papers are noisy. Try to discover themes among their work. See if that is something that you can resonate with. And that's not to say that the interview will go in this way, because people like to interview differently. Some people want to just chat about your talk. Be prepared about this. Hey, I was too busy. I didn't get to go to your talk. So tell me again, what is it that you're working about? Because I have no idea, right? So this is what's going to happen very likely in many of your interviews. And so you need to have catered answers, because there are some questions that you will always get. So that's just something that you need to be prepared about yourself. And then questions like, well, why are you excited to come to this place? Who are your most natural collaborators? What are institute centers or other resources here at this university that will be catalytic for you? Those are questions to which it's good to have an answer, because it is very easy. If you don't have a convincing answer for this, it's very easy for your interviewers to come out of that meeting saying, well, this person isn't really interested in coming here. And depending on how many offers there are to being made, being able to actually recruit people is an important decision also for search committees, because time makes a difference, right? If they get hung up in a multiple month negotiation with somebody who is unlikely to come, then the other people who are further down the line, right? The further down the food chain, who have to wait 5 months until they get to negotiate, they probably have lost interest. So that's why, like being able to communicate, well, I'm actually interested in coming here if you were to make an offer is a good idea. And preparation is one way to help you communicate that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Philip, any insights on how should candidates go about researching the institutions and the departments that they are interviewing with?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Matthias said. But in addition, I think a lot of times you consider the science, but then also considering things like location and things like that. So I remember when I was looking through programs, I primarily applied to programs on the East Coast, right? My wife's family is in New York. We wanted to be within essentially driving distance or so. So those are things that you kind of optimize to. And then also, so, the science is definitely important. The location in terms of the the things that you like to do, your family, like all those things kind of like come into play. But then also thinking through sort of like, is it like a research intensive university, like a R1 versus like where you have primarily research or like primarily teaching or so forth, right? Those are also things that also should be taken into account. So I can give from like my perspective, I wanted to be at a place that is research intensive, right? So I applied to mostly R1 institutions, but then I want to teach as well, right? So I didn't apply to any places such as like institutes that have very heavy, strong research, but no teaching, right? So those are also things to take into account. And then I guess this gets in a little bit more detail sometimes, but then even like how many courses you teach within certain departments, how much in terms of like coverage for like soft money versus hard money, like those kinds of things also play roles in selecting, right? So in engineering, typically, you would have 9 months of coverage, right? Whereas in medicine, that would be it's different, right? In some cases, it's like 3 months or so forth. And then, for instance, are somewhere in between. So there's a lot of different parameters that sort of goes into selecting these programs. And I think it depends, right? It's very like person dependent in the sense of what does each individual want? What does each individual really think is needed for success? And how they consider success or happiness and things like that. So it's a multidimensional space, but I think each person comes at it from a perspective where, if I want to be at a research intensive, I look primarily at those. And if I have a location kind of specification, then I look at those research intensive in those locations and then kind of like build in the matrix from there.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wynn, how should candidates go about researching the institutions and the departments that they are interviewing with?
I would say that you want to make sure it's all very personal. It really is. There's really no one key way of answering that. I mean, for me, it was very selective just because I was really, the factors for me were really dominated by personal reasons, not necessarily academic reasons, right? I mean, I landed in a place that suited me really well academically, but I also excluded a whole bunch of other places that would have suited me well academically just because the location wasn't where it would work for our family. But I would say that definitely don't apply at places that you don't want to go. I agree completely. Do not waste your time. Do not waste other people's time. And it becomes pretty apparent, unless you're a really great actor, it becomes pretty apparent at your interview whether or not, if you're not enthusiastic about that place, right? When I was interviewing, I was totally clued in on which school was really enthusiastic about me and which school was just, I don't know why they would interview me, because they were totally not into, the faculty were just not that interested or excited when they were meeting with me. So it's really hard to kind of fake that. And you kind of know whether or not a school is going to be interesting for you. You will look through their department webpage, you look through the faculty. And you may know some of their faculty, you talk to your advisors, you talk to your mentors about a program, and most likely they'll know about the program. And they can give you some insights as to whether or not there are institutes there that you can plug in, and such things like that. So yeah, I think that's kind of echoing what's been said so far.
Thank you so much for sharing. Now I want to open more formally the floor for any questions from the audience. Feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat or unmute yourself and ask the question. We received the first one, San Remedios. One element I have heard about when deciding between two offers is culture fit. What are some examples of a culture mismatch that I should look out for? Is it all just based on feeling, or are there red flags, green flags on culture fits between the applicant and the university?
I can start. Recently talked about this. So there are one thing that you can look at. I mean, this is in a way it's difficult because it will depend on the people that you meet with, right? So those are the people that are the face of the university for you at that moment. But there are a few policies that can help you get a feeling for what it might be like at that school. And one thing are tenure rates. So if you look at whether that school is a school that has huge assistant professor cohorts, but has a competition-based system for tenure and promotion, like Harvard, for example, does, it's a funnel, right? And so what that means is that you swim or you don't. And so what that means is that a lot of people who come in at the same level and who are all competing for the few tenure and promotion spots that are available, they are probably not inclined to be particularly helpful to one another. There are exceptions. Generalizations are always wrong, but this is an example of a culture, right, that is systemically generated that might result in specific behavior of the junior faculty, simply because they want to maximize their own level of success in a very stressful and very competitive job. So, blame them or don't, this is not my choice. So that is one thing. Hopkins, for example, has very high tenure rates. So people who go up tend to get the tenure and promotion, which is great. And so that is another thing that you can find out in addition to so that creates and might foster, a collaborative environment. And so what I find between my faculty colleagues to be the most helpful thing is for people to share openly their success and failure stories and provide examples of, say, successful proposals, course material of the courses they have been teaching and so on, because having access to that makes every step that you take as a potential future faculty member more, takes a little bit away from the educated guess and makes you take more informed steps that essentially helps you avoid sinking time in specific things. So these are questions that are difficult to ask in the first meeting because they are very touchy-feely. So, but when you go back for a second visit, in order to really understand whether that's a place that you would want to consider, try making sure that you meet with assistant professors who are like, you request meetings with junior faculty who are like you, who recently came and who might be able to talk about some of their experiences and how other colleagues have behaved relative to them, relative to their inquiries with these types of things, to understand what their experience was like. And that can help you understand, right, whether this is what happens, right? Another dimension would be how seriously are junior faculty taken in department meetings. That's another question that you can ask, and you can ask that different level or different seniority levels of faculty. You can ask at the dean, you can ask at the head, you can ask that a full professor, an associate professor, and then an assistant professor, and they will give you different ideas of how important the opinion of a junior faculty member in a department meeting is. And depending on the culture, those answers will be widely different.
You should ask about the service level and the teaching levels expected for junior faculty. Is the department going to expect a junior faculty assistant professor to start teaching a 200-person class? I think that's a really important question to ask. What kind of committees are assistant professors expected to be on? And how much time do they take? Right? Be kind of wary if you're expected to chair a committee as an assistant professor. It's going to take up a lot of time.
Dr. Philip, any insights on the culture fit aspect of interviews and applications?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, it's, as Azo said, like, talking to people, getting like, the sense of what kind of like goes into that. Because, there's some places where, you want to get an idea of what the expectations are, and then your ability to really kind of like hone, like, succeed through it, right? One thing I think is critically important too is talking to students, right? So even like, getting to talk to graduate students, postdocs, to get a feel for what the culture there is like from the student perspective, as well as the assistant professor, senior professor kind of like perspective as well. So many of the interviews that I went on, many of them had an opportunity to like meet with students. Like they would have like a lunch that you meet with like a group of graduate students. And those are sort of things like you can even ask for in the interview, right? So when they ask for the list of faculty who, you would potentially like to meet with, you can maybe, if ask to speak to some students, and then they'll have some students be able to get a perspective from.
Thank you so much. Do you have any additional questions from the audience? Remember, you can drop it in the chat or unmute yourself. Hey, Ganesh is asking, what are some points to be considered when preparing research statement, teaching statement, and diversity statement?
As I said, I currently give a lecture on all of these, so I can answer, but other people can go first also. Vicky, did you want to start?
I was going to say, you've done this more recently than I have. When I was interviewing, there was no such thing as a diversity statement or a service statement, to be honest.
So I will say, because you just lead with a diversity statement, I will just say one thing, and then I think maybe Jude, you want to add something, and then if I feel like I should add more, I can. The one thing about the diversity statement, if you look like me, Don't try to make diversity about you, because that's not what people are looking for. So, I know that this sequence I think this session here and this course series, you had a session especially on that. But I think the most important takeaway there, right, is that if you don't have personal experiences to offer, and if you so on, right, it's not really what it's about. It's about understanding the best practices and how to create and how to foster, that diverse and inclusive environments. And well, your demonstrated expertise in doing that. And if you have not done it, okay, well, first of all, start thinking about why and whether you can do something that is meaningful in the time that you have left before you apply. And if you then still haven't, then just don't make something up, right? Like, understand that diversity and inclusion, it's a field that people actually do research in. There's publications on that, where people do studies that demonstrate what works and what doesn't work. And so you really don't have to invent the wheel from anew, right? So you can rely on those types of resources, and you can say that you are committed to implementing best practices, and you can talk about what you have read and about the research that you did in order to understand what's important. So don't make this about yourself in a way.
Yeah, and it's a lot about like perspective, right? In the sense of like, I know in talking to some people who kind of approaching the job faculty market, like the diversity statement always seems sometimes like more intimidating to write than the teaching or the research, right? But it's a lot about sort of like how the perspective that you're bringing that really would impact the diversity, equity, inclusion sort of like within it, and coming at it from that it's your perspective on helping foster that really helps to kind of like open up some ways to approach it, I think, in sort of like from experience. Also, the research statement, I think, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that you want to convey the level of excitement about the research that you're really trying to do, right? Sometimes some places would ask for, like a 2-page research statement or a 6-page research statement. Like, writing a 2-page research statement versus a 6-page research statement is different, right? Because one of them, if they ask you for 6 pages, they want you to go a little bit more in detail. But if they ask you for a 2-page, you want to be like direct, and you want to keep show them how excited you are about it, like what kind of impact this research could potentially do. But then you want it to be rigorous, right? It has to be a solid sort of like approach. Show like you don't have to go into too much detail as to like the history of the field, but you want to be able to convey that the approaches that you're doing could impact, it could be game changing in terms of like from that perspective you're bringing. And for the teaching statement, I think if to say one thing on that, thing that I tended to propose classes that I am passionate about within the field, right? When I applied to biomedical engineering, a lot of the classes within biomedical engineering, I actually didn't take, right? Because my degrees are in chemical engineering. With enough time, I'm sure I could learn the material to teach it, but then you want to find courses that like you're passionate about, right? So like, for instance, in chemical engineering, we do a lot of thermodynamics, right? And in biomedical engineering, they don't have a thermodynamics class, but there's a statistical physics class, which has the statistical mechanics and thermal kind of piece. And that's the class that I am teaching. But it kind of like, you want to do something that you're passionate about, but something that you can teach well. And then at the end of the day, it's a discussion between like you and the chair, what exactly you teach. But I think conveying, not only what you're going to teach, but sort of like, again, guidelines. There's a lot of research in that in terms of how you can reach kind of like the learners and so forth. So it's not just, I want to teach this class because of this reason, but almost like building in, how am I going to reach the students? How am I going to implement the excitement for the material and convey in some of those?
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing, and then we can move on, because it's not really about those things. But I think the greater thought applies to what we're discussing here, which is interviewing and giving a talk. And that's something I said earlier. You cannot underestimate how important it is to correctly characterize what your strengths are, because you graduating from the program of your current advisor will have very unique strengths that are different from everybody else in this field. And if you try to copy in any of your statements, in your talks or anywhere else, the strengths of somebody else because you found their statements online, and so that you ended up writing that same thing, you're going to fail because it's a very personal thing, right? Like your career, your research, your program is going to be very different from other people. And if you don't spend the time to think about that and think about what your unique strengths are, then you're going to fail on the market because people will be able to tell, right? And that's why I'm saying, like, comparing is not useful. Comparing is only useful if you do it the right way. When you're looking at other people's profiles and you understand how they used their unique profile to highlight their strength. Because if not, right, you're going to say, well, how am I ever going to get a faculty job? I only have 100 citations. These other people who interview, they have 1,500, right? But the point is, you're in different fields. The strengths might be different. So you need to understand, right, how you tell your most compelling story and what your unique advantage is, and make sure that you play to your strength, to those strengths. The other thing that I want to tell here, also for other things, is that, you know, your history, you know, the papers, the motivation that you have in the papers, blah, 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 blah. All that is what you had written down because it was the best possible story you came up at the time that you did the work. Right now, it's not that time. Right now, you're trying to build a unique and cohesive story that somehow unifies who you are as a teacher, as a mentor, and as a researcher. And so you are free to tell your own story. So you can take, you know, you can't falsify the results, right? The results are the results, but you can reinterpret why they are important for what it is that you're going to be doing in the next 5 years. And if you do that the right way, you know, you can really craft statements that are incredibly impactful, that combine different insights that, if you were only to take the papers, are not really connected, but you get to connect them because you get to tell the story, right? So don't forget these types of things and really, you know, understand your strengths. And if you're not certain, talk to your advisor. They might have ideas on how to best do this.
Yeah, I agree. I think the most important thing to have is the research statement, and it has to be authentic and it has to be uniquely you. Because as Matthias says, you have a unique perspective, and we're looking for that unique perspective. That's what all the search committees are looking for. I also want to say that we get so many applications in our mechanical engineering searches. If we're particularly specific about a topic area, we'll get like 300 applications. So we might get 500 for a position. It's like huge, right? And your 500 applications are going to be reviewed by a search committee of maybe 5 people, right? And so what makes a research statement stands out for me when I read them, and I do read them, not in all great detail, but I do read quickly through the research applications, research statements, is really, do you have a perspective? If you're spending like half of your research statement just on a generic description of the field, you've lost me, right? Because I kind of, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for somebody who knows the generic field. I really want to know, do you understand the field well enough to figure out how you're going to contribute to it? So at some point, you got to, in that first half of the page, get to what's your point of view on this problem fairly quickly. And I also tell my postdocs and my PhD students that you kind of know when you're ready to apply, when you can do that. When you can sit down and say, this is my perspective on this field, then you're ready to apply. If you're not quite there yet, you need to do a little more thinking, a little more research, a little more work to get that perspective.
Thank you so much for sharing. We have another question from Yu Yang. When is the best time to ask about potential salaries, visa supports, funding opportunities, and potential collaborators in or outside the department during interviews?
You don't. You ask after you get the job offer, to be honest. If you talk about collaborators, talk about collaborators. I think that's a great time to ask during interviews. But the other stuff, don't spend your time asking that. Spend your time asking about what the environment's like for you. And then if you do get a call back and say, we're really interested in you and we want to see how we can get you to come here, that's when you ask about those things. And then you don't just ask your chair, the chair who's talking to you, ask faculty that you've talked to in the department, and you ask their peers about what the salary is.
I think inside funding opportunities is probably okay to ask, just because I think it's more about institutional support levels, right? Is this something that exists, right? Is there seed funding opportunities within the university? It's more like it goes along the lines of what Vicky was saying, is that it is a question that is directed to understand whether you will be successful there, right? The other questions about visa support, about salary, it's very personal questions that is not the time to decide, right? The other ideas, right? Like, who are my collaborators? Can I collaborate? How is your feeling with, how easy is it for you to collaborate with people in X department? Are there internal seed funding opportunities to jumpstart such collaborations? It is all directed on, hey, look, I'm so interested in coming here. Will I be successful? It's a very positive picture. It's like, what is the salary? It's like, well, if you lowball me, like, I'm out of here. And so, think about the picture that your question or the message that your question is sending.
Not only that, but you only have 15 minutes or so, 30 minutes at most with anybody you meet. And you really want to spend that time trying to figure out, as Matthias says, is this an environment that's going to make you happy? And it's going to be supportive of you.
Especially at this process, you are going to meet, we have talked through this, faculty, chair, staff, students. So we only have 5 minutes. So I would love to get your general advice, how to handle these campus visits and more informal interactions with these faculty, staff, and students as part of the interview process. Any insights on that?
So as a person who has done many search committees, all the informal times are really important as well. We want to hire good colleagues, right? We really want to see how you're going to interact with us. So please don't be a jerk. That's a surefire way of not getting hired. So you're never off, is what I would say. Even when you're at lunch or sharing a coffee with somebody, just kind of know that you are going to, your interaction with that person, you have to be, you have to be authentically you. So definitely be comfortable. But also, all of that is fair game in terms of judging whether or not they want you as a colleague, right? And I know that's a controversial statement to make, because I know we all want to just be judged on our science, but the department is run by faculty, right? Student successes are determined by how well you mentor students. Staff morale is determined by how you're going to treat faculty, treat staff. So if you don't treat the staff member who's taking care of your arrangements well, that's going to get known, right? So yeah, you're really not ever off when you're interacting with people at the department.
Cultural fit is a two-way street, huh?
Yeah, exactly, right. And I'm quite happy to say that mechanical engineering, we have very collegial atmosphere. We have really great interactions among our colleagues and with staff, and I think with students as well. So I don't think that would have been possible if we didn't pay attention to that.
Thank you. Dr. Umberath or Dr. Philip, any insights on how to handle these campus visits and the more informal interactions with all the campus stakeholders?
Yeah, I'll say something that I find always very entertaining. It's like, I'm talking to you here wearing climbing pants. You can't see them, a t-shirt, and like a pullover. But I will say, when you're going for the campus visit, when in doubt, overdress, because nobody ever said, well, I wish that person looked just a little bit more shabby. Nobody ever said that. So you want to leave a good impression, exactly as Nikki is saying. Like, you'll be judged all the time. Don't get hammered. Don't be a jerk. And that's not limited to your interview, right? Just maybe as a general good life advice, just don't be a jerk. But the other thing is, understand that you are going there as a potential colleague, and so that means that you need to make sure that you can take care of yourself. So if you require a restroom break, even if that cuts down your interview time by 10 minutes, ask for it, right? You shouldn't be sitting there. It's like, yeah. So you make sure that you stand up for yourself, that you get what you need. Like if you need water, if you need a restroom break or something like that, you can ask for it, and you should be getting it. If you don't, that tells you something about the culture. And so all of these things. The other thing is, you should probably be coming prepared. So your day will be long. If you know that you get hangry, pack a snack. If you know that you need water to talk for prolonged periods of time, hey, you're going to talk the whole day, bring water, right? So make sure that you set yourself up for success. Some of these things are really just predictable. So
it's a long day. When I interviewed, it was 2 days. So it was a long 2 days.
When I interviewed at Hopkins, I got this, I interviewed here for my tenure track position as an internal candidate. I had a week of interviews.
Oh, wow.
Because people scheduled whenever they felt like it. So it is really exhausting, and everybody will understand that when you come home from there, it's exhausting, and traveling adds to that. So, professional, comfortable, and make sure that you have everything that you need in order to take care of yourself, because you gotta not just be yourself, you gotta be the best version of yourself when you interview.
Dr. Phillips, any final
Yeah,
pieces of advice before we close?
Yeah, if and like one thing, if I were to add one thing, is just in terms of like, you're going in, coming with confidence, right? Just knowing that, you're at a campus visit because they've seen something in your application, like is a place that you should be, like this is not the point to kind of like start doubting, right? So you kind of like want to go in there with like some level of confidence when you're presenting, like, that you can see the confidence and the excitement that you have. So kind of like, showing the passion and showing your excitement about being there is one of the things we don't necessarily think about, but it has such an impact on the people within the department that that are looking for a colleague, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Nguyen, Dr. Philip, and Dr. Umbera, for accepting our invite and sharing all your insights and advice today. I hope everyone have a great weekend and wishing you all the best during your job market, filling applications, and preparing for interviews as you undergo in these life changes and career transitions into faculty position. Again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to our panelists.